Brian 2 at Belgrade Airport in Belgrade, Serbia. And they've taken my bag. And this has happened many times. This is not the first time. It's not an isolated incident. They've done this many times. First time they did it was back in 2013. They put a pair of purple panties in my luggage. I got it 2 weeks later after they took it. Oh, we found your luggage. There's a pair of purple panties and the top said fabulous. And they've done it many other times. They've stolen property. I keep count the number of times they vandalized stolen property, put it back, take it, put it back, take it. Well, it's just another game, but that bag was full of over $1,000 worth of gear. 2 sleeping bags which were expensive. So this is the game that targeted individuals go through on a regular basis. This is Brian 2, 8:30, September 9, 2024, at Nikola Tesla Airport, Belgrade, Serbia. Nikola Tesla Airport, waiting on my bags. I'm getting ready to walk out the door. This is Nikola Tesla Airport, and my bag has disappeared. Belgrade, Serbia. Welcome to the hyper game. Can't sleep. They won't let me sleep. I didn't sleep at all last night. I have an international flight this morning. They never let me sleep before international flights. The only thing literally is, they do this to me all the time. Since 2011, constant sleep deprivation torture, almost no sleep every night. And especially during international travel, all you have to do is look at my face and you can see the sleep deprivation torture in my face. The only thing keeping me awake, the only thing keeping me from passing out, is this stream of ELF waves, electromagnetic low frequency waves, just constantly radiating my brain. This stream of energy radiating my brain, that's all that's keeping me from passing out. And they do this to me often. All target individuals, mind control victims. Hi, this is Brian 2 in San Diego, California, 8:35 a.m. on August 2nd, 2018. I want to talk about the technology in organized stalking and how mind control technologies are used in conjunction with organized stalking to try and help other people. First, I'll touch on some basics, and then I'll go over in detail what I'm trying to discuss in case people don't look at my previous videos. Organized stalking is based on the choice reference patterns of the victim. In order to understand organized stalking, the victim must therefore go back and look at a pattern of their previous choices, favorite bars, cafes, restaurants, modes of transportation, etc. Once the victim understands that technology is based on the choice reference patterns of the victim, then the victim must understand what it's comprised of. In organized stalking, while it's based on one thing, choice reference patterns, where the organized stalkers are placed at specific vantage points based on those previous choices, it's actually comprised of two things. Organized stalking is comprised of situational scenarios and conversational scenarios, always designed to capture, based on events or topics that will capture the attention of the victim. The victim is not aware that he's being stalked, and organized stalking is ineffective. Big difference between organized stalking and surveillance. In surveillance, the government either doesn't want the victim to know or doesn't care if the victim knows, but with organized stalking, the victim must know they're being stalked or it's not effective. They're using it to establish memory anchors, memory reference points. It just happened with me out at the trolley stop here at the mall. He sat down next to me, stepped into my visual field, and then waited for me to commit, and then committed in the same direction that I was committing. I was waiting for him to commit. In other words, he needed to capture my attention and generate an emotional response. That's what I mean by memory anchors. Okay, they have different tactics of doing this It must be aggressive at regular intervals in order to keep the victim sensitized to the organized stalking. But it's done to generate memory anchors, to provoke the victim into memory anchors, and I'll explain what that is. What you have to understand first what verification is. Verification is their ability to verify the responses of the victim are consistent, as each response is identified, developed, and remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data. So basically, what they've done is they've taken the brain of the victim. The CIA and DIA contractors have taken the brainwave signature of the victim. They've mapped the brainwave signature. They then take that digital brainwave imprint and they upload it back to their conscious computer, their Exa-Scale system. Okay, and then they remotely tie the victim to that conscious supercomputer for life by way of a bidirectional stream of electromagnetic low frequency waves, photons, called the information and injection feedback loop. Okay, which that supercomputer, by way of this bidirectional stream of energy, then remotely monitors and manipulates all electromagnetic activity of the victim's brain until the day of the victim's untimely death. Cold-blooded murder. They cannot allow witnesses to live, to exist. Trauma-based mind control victims cannot be allowed to walk away. They could become a loose cannon. They could come back in the future to testify against them, etc., etc., etc. They're simply not going to allow any of those possibilities to occur. The victims generally die from the physical effects of the torture and trauma. They're using torture and trauma to depattern the victim's brain so it can be repatterned with this fabricated and falsified stream of electromagnetic low frequency waves, specifically tuned to the brainwave signature of the victim. Okay, so this is done, it monitors and manipulates, measures, transmits all electromagnetic activity of the victim's brain, all the electromagnetic emission patterns associated with memory and thought, back to the supercomputer by way of this bidirectional stream of energy. This is called transcranial brain stimulation, and is basically a brain-to-computer interface used by the Department of Defense and the CIA with other brain-to-computer interfaces, such as that used by the pilot of the F-35 stealth fighter. The pilot of the F-35 stealth fighter does not control the plane, the weapon systems, communication, navigation, etc. of that stealth fighter manually if he doesn't have to. While he can manually inject, he controls the stealth fighter, the F-35, and all of its systems with his brainwaves. This is called a brain-to-computer interface. That's similar to what they're using on their victims. They're using two interfaces. One is the supercomputer, which is the brain-to-computer interface. The other is the neurochip, which is the electronic brain-to-brain interface. Okay, so basically, understand they must verify each response. They must continually provoke the victim over and over again until they establish a pattern of emotional responses. With the system, once they establish these emotional responses, memory anchors. Okay, then the system then turns around and begins to probe the victim using that specific memory anchor, that specific memory reference that was just generated, to determine a set of responses, to determine if those responses are coherent, to establish a pattern. That's called verification. It's seeking to verify. Let me give you an example. The organized stalking that just took place outside, there was a confrontation, okay? The organized stalking is done in sequence, timed in sequence with the remote neural attacks of severe agitation. It's high-tech entrapment, okay? But, at that point a memory anchor was established. The system captured that memory anchor in real time, downloaded it. Now it's injecting supercomputers. Now most of this is done by supercomputers. It's not done by people. Well, there are hive mind teams involved and they're responsible for these atrocities. But most of the torture and assassination is done by a supercomputer. So the system captured, any set of brainwaves can be captured, held, and listened, replayed perpetually in the victim's brain. Well, that's what they're doing. They're replaying that same brainwave pattern, emission pattern, electromagnetic emission pattern, back into my brain over and over, 15, 30 minutes later, to establish a pattern. It's injecting it back into my subconscious over and over again. The system is designed to remotely capture random bits of the senses of the victim and then to fabricate stories, mental suggestions, injected back into the subconscious of the victim at regular intervals in order to establish a set of coherent responses, determine a coherent pattern. Okay, that's what's happening. The system, if the victim is able to interact and counter the ability of the operator to do that, okay, the hive mind teams, okay, then the operator will simply vary the routine in some other way. What routine? The verification routine. Okay? They're constantly running a person. Every response of the victim, every single response, must be verified. It's not enough that they have the raw data or they think it's consistent. They must verify those responses are consistent before they can be downloaded and integrated back into R&M data as they continue to build a cognitive model of the victim's brain in order to eventually achieve direct behavioral control over the victim, okay? Because the technology is so sophisticated and advanced, people just simply can't come to believe that these atrocities are happening. That's called the Occam razor principle. They rely on the Occam razor principle in order to discredit their victims. The Occam razor principle basically holds that the more complicated the truth, the less the likelihood of belief by the ordinary person. It basically means the Occam razor principle basically establishes that the simplest answer is always the truth, the simplest explanation is always the best explanation. So in order to discredit a person, one need only engage in a sufficiently complex scheme of harassment, and because the more complicated the truth, the less the likelihood of belief by the ordinary person, the complexity of their harassment itself will generally be enough to cause most people to turn away in disbelief. That's called the Occam razor principle, and that's what they're relying on. Okay, that's what these tailored scripted mind games of organized stalking are all about. Not just to constantly provoke the victim into emotional responses which can be remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data, okay, but also to discredit the victim in ways which appear common, ordinary, and expected to the casual observer. That's how the technology is designed to work. You know, but it's all dependent on verification. Without verification, there could be no mind control. Verification is a crucial, and it's basically established by getting the victim to repeat the same response over and over. Such as, for example, constant disruption and chaos on the victim's computer. So the victim is forced to try and counter the chaos and disruptions on the computer each day to try to function and survive. Well, you know, one attempt to counter, that's a response. But that's not enough. They got to verify that response after you respond. So your attempt to counter must then be verified. So they continually provoke you over and continue the disruption and the chaos over and over until the victim is forced over and over to try and counter, over and over to try to adjust in order to try to function and survive, to overcome the chaos and the trauma. That's verification. The provoking of the victim into multiple responses, not one, multiple responses. The one is the response. The multiple responses after that is verification. Okay? Without the victim's response to their specific stimuli, the verification process breaks apart and mind control fails, which is why they cannot allow the victim to engage in a pattern of random or chaotic conversations and situations. It disrupts their technology. So they got the victim boxed in. Everywhere the victim goes, he's boxed in inside what's called a psychotronic concentration camp. It's basically a floating box of organized stalkers and surveillance teams, okay, which the hive mind teams manually inject themselves into at regular intervals for the purposes of training, research and development, verification, etc., using line of sight and so forth, okay? But that's basically what it is. If you want to understand organized stalking, if you want to understand trauma-based mind control, think of The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, that movie, okay, where the victim was, you know, living in a make-believe world. Then when he finally found out it was make-believe and tried to escape, they tried to stop him, and they kept him in a floating box, okay, boxed in, okay, and it's a combination of The Truman Show, that movie, and The Exorcist, where they take neuroscience using satanic ritual abuse, stalking, harassment, torture, terror, trauma, violence, chaos. It's called satanic ritual abuse. It's a combination of those two movies that may help the victim in the theater of your mind begin to understand what's happening and how it works. It's a combination of The Truman Show and The Exorcist. That's trauma-based mind control. They have married neuroscience to the occult. They have weaponized neuroscience. Okay? So they need to generate multiple response statistics, multiple responses, which they can then correlate into what are called response statistics, and then take those response statistics, and from those that statistical data, determine a coherent pattern of thought, which can then be remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data. So remote neural monitoring is their ability to remotely measure, image, measure, and transmit that data remotely via this bidirectional stream of energy called the information and injection feedback loop. Okay, this is why the organized stalkers are constantly provoking you, constantly forcing you to adjust away. You know, I didn't adjust away. I just knocked the guy back about 20 feet, but that's what they wanted me to do. That's what they wanted me to do. They wanted to provoke me. You know, they will simply not. They cannot allow the victim to ignore them. If the victim can ignore them, their technology will fail because the cognitive model their building will erode. Okay. Their technology will erode, I should say. Okay, so they constantly must capture the victim's attention, must stalk the victim, must provoke the victim, and if the victim can ignore them, their technology will fail, but they will not allow the victim to ignore them. They will not allow it, okay? These tailored scripted mind games based on organized stalking, situational and conversational scenarios called street theater is how they achieve the cognitive model by constantly provoking the victim into emotional responses which can be remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data. Okay, so once they have that statistical data, consistent statistics, which they were able to verify, they're consistent now, okay? They then take those previous choices of the victim, choice reference patterns, okay, those choice references, and they, of that memory anchor they just established with the organized stalking, and the R&M supercomputer begins to inject, not manually, but automated, active, it's all automated, active, and adaptive, okay? The supercomputer then begins to inject that previous choice reference, that previous memory anchor of the organized stalking that was based on your choice references, patterns of your choice references, okay, back into your subconscious at regular intervals in order to pitch you into some type of action or access sequence, in order to manipulate and control you. Using these memory references, the previous memory anchors, and impulse injections, agitation. Basically, the system not only captures the memory anchor, the memory reference, it also captures the associated impulse the victim has with that memory reference. So, severe agitation and rage, for example, or lust, fear, paranoia, etc. These are called motivational impulses. So, it doesn't just capture the previous memory, the anchor, the memory reference, the actual event. It captures the associated impulse as well. Okay, and then once it's able to establish consistent responses from the victim, that last response to the victim becomes the pattern for the next wave of torture and harassment. Why? Because they must generate patterns, consistently generate patterns. That's why organized stalking is based on the hypergame theory. The hypergame theory meaning the non-cooperative gaming theorem. They must constantly provoke the victim, force the victim into an endless series of countermoves trying to function and survive by creating a hostile environment everywhere the victim goes inside this floating box, inside this psychotronic concentration camp. There's so many people complaining of this now. I mean, it cannot simply be dismissed as mere public hysteria anymore. Okay, it's absolutely happening. They're in an arms race. The Americans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Europeans are all in an arms race to develop this technology. And the government, who is first in the world to develop and fully develop and implement it, will have an incomparable advantage over every other government on Earth. Therefore, they cannot use animals in mind control, training, research, and development. They must use real human minds. They must use innocent people. Okay, and that's what's happening to me and so many others. Okay, so what is verification then? Verification is forcing the victim to respond over and over again, to engage in some type of repeated verbalization or related action specific to that provocation, specific to that organized stalking, specific to that chaos and trauma. Okay, so it's taking the associated impulse and it's injecting it back into the victim's subconscious at regular intervals. Those are called impulse injections, impulse sequencing, I should say. Okay, and then to manipulate the victim, to control you, to convince you that the response it was your own, when it's not. It's a fabricated and falsified response. It was your own. It was your own memory. It was your own emotion. Okay, associated with that memory, but it's now owned by the supercomputer, which is now using your own memory references against you and injecting them back into your subconscious at regular intervals. Okay, to influence you to complete or describe that actual memory reference, okay, that previous memory, okay, by making some type of appropriate verbalization or engaging in some type of related action specific to that specific memory reference, which was just captured by the supercomputer, which is called, drum roll please, verification. They must verify the responses. They're going to constantly run the victim each day through a verification routine. So understand what's happening. The organized stalking was to provoke me. The system injecting the memory reference of that organized stalking and the associated impulse, the emotion of agitation and anger and rage, back into my subconscious 30 minutes later over and over in a repeated pattern is called verification, to probe me for a set of responses to determine a coherent pattern of thought specific to that memory reference that just happened with the organized stalking. The technology is not that sophisticated and advanced that people can't begin to get a basic understanding of how it works. It's just that they won't even try. And that's the Occam razor principle. The more complicated the truth, the less the likelihood of belief by the ordinary person. The organized stalking they rely on that, okay? Once they see what the victim responds to emotionally or intellectually, that's when they begin to fabricate these conversational and situational scenarios. Street theater, based on events or topics that they know will capture your attention. If they cannot capture your attention, their technology fails. Okay, so what happened just now at the trolley stop was called mirroring. Okay, organized stalking uses a number of different tactics. One of them is called mirroring. What he did is he sat down right next to me, then he stood up right next to me, and then he waited for me to move in a specific direction, and then he mirrored my move. Again, that's called mirroring. It's a tactic of organized stalking. Organized stalking is used by law enforcement. Organized stalking is used for a number of different reasons, for surveillance, etc. I mean, they use it to set up and entrap the victim. They use organized stalking for a lot of different things. It's basically informants that have been turned into provocateurs. They take the informants, this army of hundreds of thousands of informants in every city in America, okay, and they take that army of informants and they turn them into provocateurs. Many of them don't even realize they're being used as provocateurs, where others know full well what's going on. Okay? So they're using an army of informants turned into provocateurs to constantly provoke and engage the victim. They will not allow the victim to ignore them. That's organized stalking. Okay? So that's street theater. So once the system, this R&M supercomputer that the victim's brain is remotely tied to, can verify that the selected responses are consistent, that's when those selected responses become the pattern for the next wave of a torture and harassment. Why? Because they must generate patterns. If I do something, they need me to do it over and over and over and over again. Not just once. They need to establish a coherent pattern for every single response of the victim as the system remotely measures, using physical and psychological trauma, maps out and reverse engineers the sensory and neural pathways of the victim's brain and central nervous system in order to determine how to build a cognitive model of the victim's brain inside their database. What is a cognitive model of the victim's brain? It's a copycat parallel twin personality of the victim's human soul. What is the victim's human soul? It is the will, intellect, and emotion of the victim. Man is basically a triune being, body, soul, and spirit. Body, in simple terminology, is the five senses: sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell. Okay, in simple terminology, okay, it's the five senses. That's the body: sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell. The soul, human soul, is the will, intellect, and emotion, and then the spirit is the conscience of man. Okay, well, that's what they're targeting. They're targeting the human soul, the will, intellect, and emotion of the victim, and they're using trauma, physical and psychological trauma, to replicate it inside their database, to build a cognitive model of that, a copycat parallel twin personality of the victim's brain, in order to control. It's all about training, research, and development. That's what it is. Training, research, and development. They don't care who they have to torture and assassinate. They don't. All these shooters, not all of them are just men who just suddenly just went off the deep end. They're people who were forced off the deep end with mind control technologies. People don't understand why would they do such a thing. Training, research, and development. Listen, what is the first thing Hitler did after he took power? He outlawed guns. He took away all the guns. That's what they're trying to do. They don't want people out there with guns. And so there are a number of different other reasons why they can do it. They can shape public policy and control people and populations and turn America into a police state with all these so-called manufactured terrorist acts. They're not terrorists. They're mind control victims. Most of them didn't even realize it. The Las Vegas shooter, the Aurora Batman shooter, the Navy Yard shooter, the Florida State shooter. Okay? They're mind control victims. People just can't get a handle on the fact that their government is so depraved that they would engage in such atrocities to begin with. But the CIA has a history of such atrocities. This didn't just start recently. They're all the evidence necessary to prove these atrocities are happening already exists. The CIA was caught red-handed with documentary evidence, fully caught, and had to admit to the fact that this happened in the Senate hearings and the Church Commission hearings in the 1970s with MK Ultra. The CIA had made a mistake in a FOIA request, and they had leaked documents by accident that proved their atrocities were happening, and they were forced to admit it. And there were all these investigations and commission hearings where people came forward, victims came forward to testify. The CIA was caught all the information, all the evidence to prove that these atrocities are happening to me and others just like me already exists. There's no need for any more trials or hearings or administrative appeals. It's already out there. It already exists. you know, I don't understand. Basically, people want to know how the technology is deployed. The technology is deployed basically. Now this is, make it as simple as possible, because we don't fully understand it ourselves, but we have a basic understanding of how the technology is deployed against mind control victims. Basically, a computer. If you think of cell phone technology, it begins to nothing like cell phone technology. It's far more sophisticated and advanced than cell phone technology. But if you can think of how cell phone technology works, you can begin to understand how, in a theater of your mind, how it's deployed. Okay, so what happens is a computer multiplexer routes the signal to a tower, satellite, or mobile platform, and then the tower, satellite, or mobile platform relays the signal to the digital receiver, similar to how cell phone technology works. So the digital receiver is tracked and pinpointed in real time, just like a cell phone, except with CIA and DIA mind control technologies. The digital receiver is not a phone. It is a human brain. The brain of the victim has been digitalized by the nanotechnology inside of it. They had the victim ingest additional nanostructures inside in their food or their drink, breathe in the form of smart dust, etc. And then once the nanotechnology is inside the victim's body, it migrates through the bloodstream to the brain and adheres to the neurotransmitters of the victim's brain and begins to speak to and decode those neurotransmitters by way of a process called transcranial brain stimulation, directed energy flashing, and so on. Okay? It's this bidirectional stream of energy. It's basically the nanotechnology is an amplifier. It adheres to the neurotransmitters and begins to speak to and decode the neurotransmitters of the victim's brain. So that's what they're doing is they're basically cloning, okay, the brain of the victim, not just the brain, okay, not just a cognitive model, a generic model of the victim's brain and central nervous system achieved by the way of physical and psychological trauma to map out and reverse engineer the sensory and neural pathways of the victim's brain and central nervous system to build that generic cognitive model. No, this is far more sadistic and evil. They're actually attempting to build a copycat parallel twin personality of the victim's human soul. That's how they do it. That's how they reverse engineer the will, intellect, and emotion of the victim. Okay? They're actually literally cloning the entire personality of the victim, the entire psyche and persona of the victim back into their database as they complete this cognitive model of the victim's will, intellect, and emotion. Human soul. Transcranial brain stimulation. They illumine the brain of the victim with a stream of photons and then they read the return training signal. But it's not enough that they can do that. They must provoke the victim constantly using these tailor-made scripted games, mind games, using organized stalking into every type of emotion, because different data, information can be accessed in different emotional states of the victim as they map out and reverse engineer the 7 different vectors of the victim's emotional state. The supercomputer locks onto the emotional state of the victim, okay? And begins to speak to and decode the neurotransmitters, interfacing with the stream of energy, interfacing with the nanotechnology inside of it. It's basically, transcranial brain stimulation. When I say directed energy flashing, I'm basically talking about directed energy radiation, electromagnetic low frequency waves, bioelectric R&D. Again, it's the return training signal, and anything which interrupts that return training signal, such as pleasing music, they must stop or minimize, which they've done with me with severe acoustic trauma and nerve damage after I began to understand their technology and was able to use pleasing music, Christian music, not only to break brain entrainment with their system, but to de-pattern the satanic ritual abuse, which is the neuroprogramming and the stalking and the harassment and the gaslighting and the etc. Violence and trauma, all of that, is de-patterned by Christian music and Christian content. Well, they had to stop that Christian music. They had to stop it. So they severely damaged my ears, which is diagnosed. It's on YouTube. Attorneys told the paramedics yesterday. My attorney told the paramedics yesterday, there's proof that these attacks are happening. Their medical evidence offers irrefutable proof that his client, me, is being attacked. So what did the paramedics do? They hung the phone up, called the police, said I was psychotic. You're not going to find any help in America and most of the rest of the world, okay, where the Americans control 126 different nations, directly or indirectly. You're not going to get any help there, okay? It's just impossible. They're not going to allow medical evidence to exist which corroborates their atrocities. They're not going to allow it. And sleep deprivation torture is a way they also discredit the victim, make the victim appear delusional, schizophrenic, etc., because the victim's brain is placed into a constant state of functional disorientation where he can't function and survive normally. So the victim appears delusional, and they can literally pitch the victim with sleep deprivation torture long enough, they can pitch the victim into psychosis. There can be no trauma-based mind control without sleep deprivation torture. But you must understand that it's all based on the mathematical model known as the hypergame theory. Basically, hypergame theory is called the non-cooperative gaming theorem. The non-cooperative gaming theorem is the name of the model. Hypergame theory is just a moniker to describe that model, that non-cooperative gaming theorem. And basically, it's achieved by combining two models into one. It's game theory applied to decision tree modeling. Okay, so John Nash basically proved, Professor John Nash of Harvard basically proved that by combining game theory with decision tree modeling, he mathematically proved that one could by constantly and perpetually altering any value in the model, one can constantly and perpetually alter that model's expected outcome. That's how they forced the victim into an endless series of counter moves and forced adjustments each day away from the organized stalking. Provoked the victim constantly by forcing the victim into an endless series of counter moves. Because in trauma-based mind control, the model is the victim. So by constantly and perpetually altering any value in the daily life, daily activities, finances, communications, health and well-being, etc. of the victim, they can constantly and perpetually alter the outcome of the daily life, daily activities, finances, communications, health and well-being, etc. of the victim. That's hypergame theory. By altering any value in the model, by constantly and perpetually altering any value in the model, one can constantly and perpetually alter that model's expected outcome. With trauma-based mind control, the model is the victim. By constantly and perpetually altering any value in the daily life, daily activities of the victim, they can constantly and perpetually alter the outcome of the daily life and daily activities of the victim. That's how they build a cognitive model of the victim's brain, by constantly forcing the victim into a series of endless responses, forced adjustments away from the organized stalking, the chaos, the trauma, etc. Okay, each day trying to function and survive, which the system remotely captures, and then and downloads back into its system. Okay, that's how it works. It's all called the hypergame theory. They cannot allow the victim to ignore them. If the victim ignores them, their technology will fail. It's not enough the victim, listen, they cannot allow the victim to engage in a random and chaotic pattern of conversations and situations each day. That's why they box the victim inside this floating box with organized stalking. They use law enforcement. The CIA and DIA hive mind teams are hiding behind and using law enforcement with me over 21 years. 21 years. Oh, I've been under investigation for 21 years? People, wake up. They're hiding behind and using law enforcement to do their dirty work. They got it, especially when I'm running all over the world. China, Russia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Cuba, all through Europe, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. No, they got to stop that, or they got to justify that surveillance. Okay, now they couldn't stop it, so they had to justify the surveillance. We got to keep this guy under 24/7 surveillance. He's a criminal. For 21 years, you're going to investigate somebody for 21 years. It didn't take 21 years to investigate Carlos the Jackal. No, they had to justify the surveillance in countries which were hostile to them. In Europe, they can do whatever they want, except in Serbia, where I was in Serbia. Okay, they can do whatever they want. Okay, in the countries which they control directly or indirectly, they can get away with whatever atrocities they like. But in countries which don't trust the Americans, or which are hostile or indifferent to American hegemony, the Americans had to justify their surveillance, which trauma-based mind control is dependent upon. They cannot allow the victim to engage in a random, chaotic pattern of situations and conversations each day. They must keep the victim under constant surveillance. These organized stalkers are being used as verification markers and verification triggers. So, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Cuba, Serbia, other countries, okay, the Americans simply had to justify that surveillance. They're using them as verification markers and verification triggers. If you begin to engage in and with someone who's not plugged into the paradigm, it's not enough that you respond to any situation or conversation. You must respond to their specific conversations and their specific situations. Okay? Well, the verification process breaks apart and mind control fails. They simply cannot verify those responses are consistent. It disrupts their technology. It creates a gap. And too many gaps cause problems. Okay? So they need to get a verification marker near the person. Say I'm in a restaurant and I start chatting up the waitress. Well, she's not plugged into the paradigm. If I haven't been there before, if it's the first time I've been there, okay, there's no possible way the waitress or somebody else is plugged into the paradigm. because it's random and chaotic. So they got to get a verification marker into that restaurant. Now, the verification marker, the organized stalker, the surveillance teams may not be anywhere near their ability to hear my conversation. It doesn't matter. As long as they're in the room, the CIA and hive mind teams can say, okay, well, there's our verification marker that we're monitoring, remotely monitoring all its brainwave signals. Therefore, the conversations and situations the victim is engaged in is no longer random and chaotic in nature and can be verified. Those are called verification markers. Doesn't matter that they get near to you. Now, they want to get near to you, okay? It matters that they can put them in the same area, room with you, okay? So that the situation is no longer, or conversation is no longer chaotic and random in nature. Verification triggers, on the other hand, are organized stalkers that they're able to use to inject themselves, to directly engage you, okay? Which is why they're constantly getting in your face, constantly harassing you with organized stalking, like just happened right now at the trolley station with the mirroring. That's organized stalking. Now, this video, the technology means that the last response of the victim becomes the pattern for the next wave of torture and harassment. Well, they're building patterns. They need to generate patterns. They need to establish patterns. So the last response of the victim, this video, becomes the pattern for the next wave of torture and harassment against me. But I'm trying to help people understand, okay? It's hyper game theory, conversations and situations based on the hyper game theory to force the victim into an endless series of counter moves, of force adjustments away, electromagnetic emissions, synaptic responses of the brain of the victim, which can be remotely measured and integrated back into R&M data. It's all a game. Hyper game theory, non-cooperative gaming theorem. It's all a game, a deadly game of deception and manipulation with trauma-based mind control victims. It's a deadly, deadly game of two things: deception and manipulation. Do not accept anything that they say is truth. The surveillance teams, the hive mind teams, the R&M system that's attacking you with synthetic telepathy and V2K, etc. Do not accept anything the organized stalkers say is truth. Do not accept anything the system, the R&M supercomputer, interrogates you about as truth. This R&M supercomputer is basically designed to remotely capture random bits of your senses and what emotions, thoughts, etc. and then, based upon whatever it captures, to fabricate stories, mental suggestions, based upon whatever you just thought about, injected back into your subconscious over and over at regular intervals, every 15, 30 seconds, 90 seconds, etc., okay, to generate patterns, coherent patterns, which can be correlated into response statistics and then integrated back into R&M data, okay? So it's designed, the system is designed using these attacks, using the organized stalking, the remote neural attacks, the technology itself even, the torture and harassment is designed to constantly provoke you, okay? To constantly capture random bits of your senses and then fabricate stories based upon whatever thoughts it was able to capture, injected back into your subconscious at regular intervals to pitch you into some type of action or access sequence to achieve, deceive and manipulate you, to achieve direct behavioral control over you, to drive by force your memory and thought process, to interrogate the victim, to distract the victim, to harass the victim, to torture the victim into submission to the system's influence. What's the first step in any interrogation? To confuse and disorient the victim. Sleep deprivation, torture. The victim is so severely sleep deprived, so disoriented and drowsy, he can't fight back. Tortured to near incoherency, because he's tortured to near incoherency with sleep deprivation, torture, directed energy torture, etc. He can't fight back against the system's influences. He cannot recognize modification of his active memory, in real time anyway, and fight back against the system's influences. That's how the technology works. I've told people before, if you learn to read active memory, reading active memory is basically testing and validating your own memory. Keep an awareness of your situational perception and your state of activity, your behavior, your thoughts. It's a deadly game. They're constantly going to, if you can keep a constant awareness of your state of activity and your situational perception, then you begin to realize, or at least recognize, that these conflicting impulses are happening. Okay, and it is possible. It is possible for the system to overpower. That's how they get people to commit suicide, commit atrocities, crimes, to overpower the impulses of the victim with rage, fear, and paranoia, etc. It is possible for the system to overpower your impulses. But if you can begin to recognize that these conflicting impulses, these conflicting emotions are happening over and over again in a pattern, and you can begin to recognize the physical changes that are happening to your emotional state, and then from those powerful impulses, you can begin to, to evaluate, or at least reevaluate, your current state of thought. So these are memory attacks. They're blocking your real memories. The system is designed to block your real memories with this stream of energy, okay, and inject fabricated and falsified memories. That's mind control. If you can't recognize that it's happening, you're a sitting duck. If you can't read active memory, if you can't test and validate memory, if you can't contrast your own normal memory and thought process from the artificial impulse injections, impulse sequencing, the memory attacks that are happening. No longer your memories. It was once your memory, now it's owned by the supercomputer. And if you are kept in a constant state of functional disorientation, procedural disorientation, then the victim is more likely to respond to these attacks, to the harassment, like I just did. It's Brian 2, San Diego, California, August 1st, 2018. August 2nd, 2018.